don't go to the big chain store across the sea. Go to the local guy in the corner. Go to the mom and pop shop. So for the first time we can document, Washington turns to an American source. In September of 1770, a local gentleman who moved down from, I think, Delaware, a fellow named Jacob Gooding, he spends the equivalent of 20 Maryland dollars to buy just a plain hanger. Hanger is another term for a cutto. It's also another term for something else we'll see related to swords. So, again, remember these terms can be loosey-goosey as used in the 18th century. So for $20 Maryland currency, he buys a sword from a fellow who's got vast business contacts in Philadelphia. So we think that this sword is coming from Philly. And that makes a lot of sense to me because there's really no silversmiths working in this part of the country or anywhere else close by except for Philadelphia where you could actually go and buy a sword. Incidentally, for Ryan coin people, the $20 Maryland, see how it's listed here at 6 pounds? That's Virginia money. So, yeah. So he's probably buying a sword in Philadelphia, paying with Maryland money, and running it against his books in Virginia currency. He knew what he was doing. That's enough to make my head explode. So let's take a look at this wonderful sword. It's a beauty. And the first time I saw this sword, it was in a textbook from the 1960s, and I thought, looks like your typical British cutto from the period. It's got a lion head pommel. It's got a nicely turned grip. It's got an S-curve crossguard, and it's got a knuckle chain. Looks fairly British. And then when I got my eyes on it, I realized pretty quickly, oh no, this is American. One of the first things that screams American is the material used for the grip. This is bone. Ivory is a very difficult thing to get. We extincted the mastodons in this hemisphere a long time before George Washington was in the market for swords. So that's a clear American choice as an alternative to something expensive and imported like ivory. And in fact, I've never seen an English cutto of this period with bone handle. The crossguard is beautiful. It's cast. It's chased. It's matted. It's very, very finely worked, and it survives with its scabbard. So we believe this is the sword that Washington purchased through Gooding from some now anonymous Philadelphia smith around 1770. And we believe this is the cutto that Washington would have carried during the early part of the Revolutionary War. But if we assume that this is the 1770 cutto, what did he carry in the 1760s? So there's a possibility that one of the now lost and unknown Washington swords was an earlier form of a cutto. We just don't know. Another interesting thing was turned up right here by Mount Vernon's archaeologist. This is the decorative tab that hangs down from the scabbard locket of a silver-hilted sword. Now we know for sure it was George Washington's because it's got the lower half of the GW cipher. This is a drawing to show what it probably looked like intact. It may have come from this very sword, but there's no way to prove it. So it's kind of a win-win situation because if it didn't come from this very sword, well then there's evidence that there was yet another Washington cutto that we don't know about. So have to keep our minds open. Now it gets complicated. Once Washington dies, the swords go, they go all over the place. Susan, is your head going to explode? Okay, let's see if we can get through this. So we fast forward to the 1850s. And you're going to have to take my word for this because we haven't gotten there yet. This sword descended to Lewis William Washington through Judge Bushrod Washington. The cutto is believed to have been given by George Washington during his lifetime to John Augustine Washington I. John Augustine Washington III, his grandson, pictured right here, the last owner of Mount Vernon, swapped the sword to his cousin for this sword, which we haven't discussed yet. Okay? There's no easy way to do this, Susan. But we know it happened, because in the 1850s, when a historian named Lawson came through, he saw that particular sword that John Augustine Washington III had recently acquired at Mount Vernon, and he drew it, and it appears in his was it Field Book of the American Revolution? No, it's the other one? It's the Mount Vernon book, okay. So the sword, the Cutto, that we're talking about, the ivory handled Cutto, which we're going to see later, descends to William Lanier Washington, who's quite a character. Lanier Washington was the last family member to own this particular sword. I guess he was a bon vivant. I don't know how else to describe him, but he got himself in a little bit of trouble. He caused a bit of a hubbub in the 1920s when he consigned a big pile of family relics and papers to auction in New York City. And collectors went nuts. They gobbled up anything and everything having to do with Washington. And then the next year he showed up with another load, and people went, oh, could all this stuff really be from George Washington? And it caused a panic in the antique industry. I think it sullied his reputation, and I also think at the same time it gave him pause. Lanier Washington was married, he never had children, and he knew he was going to pass without an heir to this sword. So he spent the last few decades of his life trying to document everything he could about this particular weapon. And in 1933, right the same year he died, he left a sworn affidavit laying out the case for this sword as it came down to him for whomever would have the sword in the future. And Lanier wrote that this sword had been given by General Washington to his younger full brother, Colonel John Augustine Washington, the direct ancestor of both Lawrence and myself, and had been inherited in a direct line by his, Lawrence Washington's father. And then he goes on to talk about the trade. And the trade was documented by an uncle, Richard Washington, who was the brother of the John Augustine Washington who actually did the trade. Now, I'm really sorry to be hitting you with this genealogical stuff, but it's imperative to the understanding of the swords. So when you buy the book, hopefully you'll buy the book, and you read through it, you get confused. If you turn to the back of the book, there's a biographical dictionary discussing all the players and which swords they own. I know it may sound a little tedious or a little challenging, but it's worth understanding what happened to these swords and how they descended. It's absolutely fascinating. The long and the short of it is, Lanier Washington dies in 1933. The sword passes to his widow, and it's sold at auction when she passes in 1950. So that is when this sword comes out of the Washington family. It's bought by a prominent arms dealer in New York, who keeps it for a few years and sells it to John Latimer, a very famous sword collector, who, from what I can tell, almost immediately lends it to the National Portrait Gallery, where it's displayed for many years under the portrait of Washington. And now that sword remains the last Washington sword in private hands. And we'll be looking at it later. Okay, we're starting with sword number 5. Sword number 5 means this was the 5th one chosen. Or was it? It's apparent from reading about the nature of the choosing of the swords by the 5 nephews, all cousins, that they were trying to abide by Washington's word to a T. But Samuel Washington had choice number 5, and he let it be known before the choosing began that, I'm a serving active duty military officer, I should have that one. So it wasn't his turn. He made that known, and deference was showed. So even though he got last choice, he got the sword he wanted. This sword is important for so many reasons, as they all are, but this is the first one to become almost a shining star, because it's presented by Samuel Washington's son to the United States people in 1843. And there's a really wonderful description of it, and this was read before Congress in February of 1843. At the same time that Samuel Washington, through an intermediary, is presenting the Washington sword, he's also presenting a gold-tipped cane that was bequeathed to George Washington by Ben Franklin. He is offering both to the American people. And he says, one is the sword worn by George Washington, first as a colonel in the colonial service of Virginia in the Forbes campaign against the French and Indians, and afterwards during the whole period of the War of Independence as Commander-in-Chief of the American Army. That's not really true. The sword didn't exist in the French Indian War. We'll get to that in a little bit. And he describes it as, it is a plain cateau or hanger with a green hilt and a silver guard. On the upper ward of the scabbard is engraven J. Bailey, fish skill. It is accompanied by the buckskin belt and clasp, whereon are engraven the letters GW and figures 1757. These are all of the plainest workmanship, but substantial and in keeping with the man and the times to which they belong. I don't know if I'd really call that plain, but it's a Bailey. Bailey is one of my heroes. He should be one of your heroes too. Interesting character. He is a properly trained English cutler from Sheffield. He finds himself in business in New York around 1770. He sets up shop with a partner. He pretty quickly goes out on his own. And as the British are approaching New York City, he sees the handwriting on the wall. He's an Englishman. He wants no part of what Britain is coming to do in the New York City area. So he moves up the Hudson's River and sets up shop in a number of different locations in the Hudson's Valley. And at some point during the Revolution, you have to remember a lot of Continental Army goings on in the Hudson Valley. West Point is up there largely because of Washington. He becomes familiar with this high-end cutler working in the area. And it's known that Washington is turning to Bailey for little things like penknives and obviously something like a high-end, beautiful sword. So he's pretty clearly Washington's cutler of choice. And in fact, there's an interesting letter dated 1790 that really doesn't have much to do with swords, but Bailey is trying to get a contract to produce coins for the fledgling United States. And he reminds Washington in this letter that, hey, we did some business, remember? I sold you some stuff you really liked. So he was reminding Washington of that, hoping for some other business. Now, almost immediately, in 1779, this sword makes its appearance in Charles Willson Peale's portrait of Washington at the Battle of Princeton, which is kind of interesting because Susan just pointed out, the Battle of Princeton was probably about a year and a half before Washington got the Bailey cut there, but it didn't matter because the painting was done around 1779. You can pretty clearly see, there it is. We see it again in 1851 with Emanuel Leutz's masterpiece of, I kind of always thought of it as Washington crossing the Bering Strait. Because it doesn't really look like the Delaware River in that part of the country. But this is a masterpiece. The original hangs in the Mint. It's monumental. It's the size of this screen. And what do we see right here? We see a reasonably poor interpretation of the green-handled cutto. But it's definitely it because it doesn't look like any of other Washington swords. Now, was Leutze aware of this painting, or was he aware of the original that was owned by the United States government and probably by that time on display at the U.S. Patent Office? Probably one or the other, but it was certainly inspirational. This is where I really love to geek out. I love seeing colonial things as those in 19th century America saw fit to treat them. This sword was a celebrity. Here we have it on display in Philadelphia for the 1876 Centennial Exposition. Here we have an early photograph where the belt is still hooked to the scabbard. Here it is with his uniform, a little later on. And here it is, very poorly represented, leaning against just a chair with Franklin's cane done in about 1857. From what I can tell, this is probably the first image of one of Washington's swords that went worldwide, that got plugged into the media. I imagine, when Leutz's painting may have been reproduced in print, the sword wouldn't have been front and center, but it was here. So I'm always on the lookout for early representations of Washington's sword. I should also add, is there anybody from the Smithsonian here? Yeah. The belt, we don't know where it is. And normally I wouldn't say we don't know where it is to cast dispersion on anybody, but things sometimes get out illicitly, and if people know that they're out there, maybe they can come back. I would like more than anything to see this sword belt discovered. I think it's an amazingly important piece. So keep your eyes out for a GW 1757 engraved silver-mounted sword belt, okay? It could show up on eBay. I don't know. Okay, we're going to move on to small swords now. I know we have some fans of fencing here. Yeah, we have some fencers. But you want to pay attention to this. These are pretty close to fencing swords. Washington loved small swords. His progression of small swords spans the mid-century through the end of the century, and if you look at these things, architecturally they're the same. They kind of have the same elements. A few have a little extra doodads called quillins, but for the most part they have the little finger loopies, different shaped guards, different embellishment. What a progression of fashion. And you can see why Washington needed a variety of these things. He didn't want to be caught dead wearing the same tattered old small sword he was wearing in the French Indian War, did he? Remember, Washington was very stylistically conscientious. And for you deck art swords, you get a nice progression from the Rococo to the Neoclassical represented right here. Any deck art swords? No? So number one is the silver-hilted small sword that is very strongly associated with Washington's early military career. And we believe this is the small sword he carried when he went on some pretty unsuccessful military excursions to Pennsylvania. We believe this was at his side at Braddock's defeat, where his garments were shredded by musket balls. This was probably a witness to some very, very interesting events. And it's almost a dead common sword. Now when I say dead common, this type of sword was incredibly popular in Britain from the mid-1740s up until about 1770, this style. And it's also kind of interesting because it seems to have been very popular with American colonial militia officers. Now this example is up here. Here's George Washington's sword. It would have had a completely different look when it was new because it would have had a silver wire and tape bound grip. So it would have looked much different. And this bad boy right here, you see how close it is to what this looked like? This was carried by the colonel of the Northampton County Virginia militia in the French Indian War. Another Virginia military officer of the time period. In fact, this sword is still owned by the direct descendant of that man, and it still hangs in the house it spent the last 200 plus years in. I can't mention names, Susan, but you know what I'm talking about. It's pretty neat. Wrong button. So you can see the sword is, it's covered with this sort of fluted, swirly pattern that those museum nerds call a gadrooning. It's just a very pretty fluting, but classic Georgian fashion. It's not covering the entire surface of the sword. It's used with tasteful restraint. How was that, huh? And conveniently, it's got full London hallmarks for the year 1753, exactly the time Washington received his first military commission. It was also made by John Carman, who, I should say the hilt elements were made by John Carman, who was one of the best hilt makers working in London at the time. So it's pretty easy to connect this sword as sort of a new purchase with Washington's foray into the military. And incidentally, this is the first sword to make it to Mount Vernon. This was acquired by the ladies in 1884. Because it wasn't one of the swords chosen by the nephews, it was a lifetime gift. It descended in the family of, in the Lewis family, and was purchased on behalf of Mount Vernon by one of the ladies at that time period. So that's number one into the collection here. And just to fill up the slide, I show you John Carman's business card where it's advertising all the different wares he sold. Now speaking of the Lewis family, the next small sword in the progression is was chosen as number 2 by George Lewis, the same fellow who Washington gave the 1753 small sword to. And this is probably his most famous piece. It's on exhibit here. It's absolutely magnificent, and it's a complete set. It survives with its scabbard, it survives with its belt, It survives with its sword knot. It's an absolute beautiful thing. George Lewis was the son of his sister Betty and her husband Fielding Lewis. And this is a strong stylistic break from the earlier type. No longer does it have gadrooning. It's got fancy open work and all sorts of stuff going on, which we really do need to take a closer look at. But before we go there, I got to show you this portrait. This is the first earliest known portrait of George Washington, done by Charles Willson Peale in 1772. And that's it, isn't it? Yeah. You can agree with me, it's hard. That's it. But unlike the other Peale portraits of Washington, Peale only painted this once. This was a family piece. This was a private portrait. And it's ground zero, if you ask me. I think it's just absolutely fantastic that this new, stylish small sword is exactly what Washington chose to wear for his first formal portrait sitting. That tells you what he thinks of it. Here's some up-close shots. You can see it's got wonderful filigree work. It's got scrolls and swirls and bosses that are faceted to imitate diamond. It's got traces of gilding in the crevices. This is a dynamite-looking sword. And even though some of the gilding is worn off, it's just as glorious now as it was then. I think this is a real killer. But, no pun intended. Okay, pun intended. We'll take a look at some of the scabbard mounts, which are done en suite. They match the embellishment of the sword. And I love this right here. See, this says, "Specie, Cutler to His Majesty." And it's got this big, nasty silver repair. That's a period repair. So at some point, I'm guessing there was a silver soldered seam there that opened up, and Washington had it fixed. I love that though. And much like the Bailey Cutto, we have celebrity photographs of this sword. I'm a big American history geek. I'm a big George Washington geek. And I love finding great items like this throughout time. Up there you see sort of a press photograph that was done in 1893 for the Chicago World's Fair. In fact, when this sword left Mount Vernon and was heading to Chicago, when it arrived, it made the newspaper. "Washington sword arrives in city." They did an engraving of this. It was announced that it was going to be on display in the United States Government Building at the 1893 World's Fair, arguably the greatest World's Expo ever held, and there it was front and center, posing beautifully. But before that, and I wasn't even aware of it until fairly recently when somebody gave me a big, heavy old book. Here she is again, this time in a glass and mahogany showcase in the lobby of the Metropolitan Opera House in New York City, where they had an almost week-long celebration for Washington's inaugural centennial. Wow. Sent to New York. That's the old Metropolitan Opera House. Not the same one that's there today, for sure. That's pretty cool. And it hasn't changed. It looks the same. Next one in the progression is a little bit different. This sword is also in the collection of Morristown National Historic Park. And if you look at the 1753 small sword, you'll see a similar sort of gadrooning. This one has hallmarks that date to London, 1770. And the mark of, I believe, John Perry. But this was also another sword that wasn't in his will. This was a lifetime gift on both ends of the deal. It was presented to George Washington by General William Darke, who was a long-time good, I guess you could say, army buddy. They served together in the French and Indian War. They served together in the Revolution. And General Darke also served under Washington in the 1790s while Washington was president. So they had a long history. This sword was presented from Darke to George Washington. At some point before Washington passed away, he gave it to his nephew, Lawrence Augustine Washington, and it went down in that line. Incidentally, this is a portrait of Darke, right here, by, what was that? Kemmelmeyer, Frederick Kemmelmeyer. That is not this sword. Now, this is a curious type of sword. You notice it's got, it doesn't have the typical figure of H-shaped guard. It's got what's called a boat guard. And they called it a boat guard in the period because it looks like this thing right here. Recognize that? It looks just like a gravy boat. They still call it a gravy boat? Yeah. So, this one caused me a little bit of frustration because I had never had my hands on it. And I thought, aha, somebody misread the hallmarks. Because we have a document, a letter from Washington where he says, he's writing to a factor, and he's complaining about a missing order for a small sword of 8 or 10 guineas price. Washington thinks something has gone amiss, and he wants to know about it. Where is it? And the scabbards and the slips. So he basically is ordering a whole setup of swords, extra scabbards, and a slip is sort of a case to put on the whole sword while it's in a scabbard. Then, in November of 1757, Washington records an invoice that says a fine, strong, silver-pierced, boat-shelled, two-edged sword, silver and gold grip, spare and false scabbards, etc. So I was really hoping that, well, maybe Washington ordered a pierced sword. Maybe he got a solid hilted sword. Because if this had hallmarks from the late 1750s, I could say, well, maybe his factor in London didn't get him exactly what he wanted, but he would have been happy with it. Nope. This is from 1770. This is not the 1757 boat-guarded sword that Washington ordered, which is one for sure that we know is MIA. Now, this sword descends in a branch of the Washington family that heads out to Texas. Yep. And it had a pretty rough life. It got a little bit messed up. It was on exhibition in New York City in 1889, where it was a previously unknown Washington sword. It attracted attention, and a family member named Thornton Washington went on the record with this account of the sword. This sword was not one of the 5 mentioned in George Washington's will. It, together with a suit of clothes, was presented by G.W. in person to Lawrence Augustine Washington, a nephew of his and a son of his oldest full brother, Colonel Samuel Washington, late of Harwood, Berkeley County, now Jefferson County, West Virginia. This Lawrence A. Washington, together with a brother, George Steptoe Washington, were left orphans by the death of their father, the said colonel, in the fall of 1781. On the death of Lawrence A. Washington about 1824, his sword and suit went to his son of the same name. He, the last name L.A.W., Lawrence Augustine Washington. After graduating at the Medical College in Philadelphia, moved with his family to Texas and died out there about 10 years ago. And his widow, Mrs. Martha D. Washington, another Martha Washington, who had become impoverished by the war, meaning the Civil War, and who became the owner of these relics, placed them in my hands for sale. They have never been on any public exhibition. They are now the property of the Washington Association at Morristown, New Jersey. And that's where they remained until 1933 when they were transferred to the National Park Service. And again, not Washington sword. Notice the difference. See how this is down here when it should be up there? This thing is all battered up. And when I saw it, I knew immediately it was distorted. It doesn't have the grip wire that it should. And here's the proof in the pudding. This engraving appeared in a New York periodical in 1889. The counterguard is on the sword backwards. So it had been pulled apart and put together wrong, and somebody has since corrected it. Also, number 4. This one's kind of wow, isn't it? It's a radical departure. It's bedazzled. I mean, look at those studs all over the place. It's just outrageous. This sword was chosen first. And it was chosen, it was supposed to go to George Corbin Washington. He couldn't be present, so he had his cousin, Judge Bushrod Washington, make a choice. As recorded by George Corbin Washington's son, William A. Washington's son, George Corbin Washington. Now I'm getting mixed up. Here's the tale. My father, William A. Washington, was entitled the first choice on the terms of the will, but was prevented by indisposition from attending at Mount Vernon, where the distribution took place, and Judge Bushrod Washington selected for him the most finished and costly sword, with which associations were connected highly complementary to General Washington. So he basically went for what would have been the best. And as a sword collector, I might say, I don't know if that's the best. I don't think it would bring more than the other ones on eBay. But it is the best. When you look at it from the point of view of a gentleman in the year 1800 or so, what sword is the best? What's the most relevant and fashionable and pretty and pricey if you had to buy it from London? It's this one. Now, this sword is also very strongly tied to Washington's later years. Writing in 1833, a Judge William Sullivan describes visiting Washington at the presidential mansion in Philadelphia, where he describes Washington in a black velvet suit and, quote, a long sword with a finely wrought and polished steel hilt, which appeared at the left hip. The coat worn over the sword so that the hilt and the part below the folds of the coat were in view. The scabbard was white polished leather. Now, around this time, this sword acquired the legend that it was presented to George Washington by Frederick the Great with the quote, from the world's oldest general to the world's greatest general. There's no proof it ever happened. This is an English small sword. It's a nice idea, but we have further proof that this wasn't it. Now, this is where I have to tell you a tale of caution and a mea culpa. This is a sword that, conservatively, I would have dated it 1785 to 1790, maybe 1795, based on the pattern books in the Birmingham Library from the firm of Bolton and Watt. They designed crazy sword hilts beginning in the late 1770s. The book is undated. It's now been cannibalized and cut up and rearranged like a scrapbook. So we all kind of thought, well, it makes sense that since this sword is mid-1780s at the earliest, that this is something that the newly elected Washington probably acquired fresh for his new post as President of the United States. That makes good sense. Well, when you set out to write something like this, it's kind of like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, and when you open the box, you automatically know you do not have all the pieces, and you're not exactly sure what the picture's supposed to be. So we went to press, thinking that this is something associated with Washington's inauguration, and we were wrong. The document showed up, which blows things out of the water. Washington had this as early as 1779, in the middle of the Revolution. I would venture to guess there wasn't another sword like it anywhere in America, except for maybe on the hip of a wealthy British officer. How do we know he had it? Because Washington, through one of his subalterns, sends it to his man, his cutler, Bailey, in Fishkill, or wherever he's working at the time, because he doesn't like the blade on the sword. So he has Bailey swap the blade off of the steel-hilted sword, switch it with another sword that he already's got sitting around. And at the same time, he tells Bailey to coat the tang of the blade, the part of the blade that goes up through the handle, with red sealing wax so the polished steel picks up that luster. Oh my God. That tells you it's definitely this sword, because what other sword has this open work? Now, I colored this in Photoshop, but that's what it looked like. Now, you got to bear in mind, when this sword was new, it was polished to a mirror finish. It was bedazzled. It was very, very shiny. And there might even be a little bit of proof. I just noticed this while putting together the slideshow. Here's some more close-up views of the sword so you can see its detail. It appeared in the 1834 Vanderlyn version of the Lansdowne portrait of Washington, now in the United States House of Representatives. This is interesting because it's very clearly this sword, which means that I think at the time, let's see, I want to get the right Washington. Yeah, George Corbin Washington owned the sword at the time Vanderlyn painted this, so he obviously had access to it, but see that color red? That's right where that sealing wax would have shown through. And knowing a little bit about painting, this sword was very, very shiny. It's not picking up all the colors around it. I think that's just a hint of what may be that sealing wax. What do you think, Susan? Am I nuts? You'll buy it? Okay. If Susan says okay, then I'm feeling like I'm on firm ground. Okay, now the story gets really hairy with the sword. Nothing to do with Frederick the Great. Somehow or another, at the height of the Revolution, it gets into George Washington's hands. God knows how. Maybe it was captured on a British prize. Either way, he's got it in late 1779. Sword number one, it descends through that line of the family. It ends up in the 1850s, the property of a Colonel Lewis William Washington. Okay, here's another crazy flowchart. You're probably wondering why John Brown is up there on the screen, who is an interesting character, simultaneously a hero and a domestic terrorist. Before he launches his attack at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, with the intention of capturing arms, arming local slaves, and starting a slave insurrection that would end the institution of slavery in America, he dispatches his man, John Cook, to Lewis Washington's house, Bel Air, to not only steal Washington's sword, but to steal Colonel Washington. So he's got this hostage who's almost a national treasure, but he wants Washington's sword and Washington's pistol on his side as sort of divine talisman. Somehow or another, he thinks that by having these weapons with him, he's going to have the spirit of God and Washington with him, so he had to succeed. I think we know how that ended. Washington was unharmed when the United States Marines stormed Harper's Ferry. John Brown was hurt pretty bad. And there's an interesting account. Lieutenant Israel Green of the Marines was one of the first to break through the door of what's now known as Brown's Fort at Harper's Ferry, right here. So Green's account is kind of interesting. The first person I saw was Colonel Lewis Washington, who was standing near the hose cart at the front of the engine house. The engine house is where they kept the fire engines for the arsenal. On one knee, a few feet to the left, knelt a man with a carbine in his hand, just pulling the lever to reload. "Hello, Green," said Colonel Washington, and he reached out his hand to me. I grasped it with my left hand, having my saber uplifted in my right, and he said, pointing to the kneeling figure, "This is Osawatomie," which is a nickname for John Brown for previous deeds. And at that point, Brown proceeds to hack up. At that point, Green proceeds to hack up Brown pretty bad. And in fact, at one point, he complains about his sword bending because something on his person was hard. It bent the sword. I think it may have been fittings on the sword belt suspending Washington's sword. Well, Lewis William Washington went unharmed. The sword went unharmed. Brown and Cook got their necks stretched, and that was the end of that story. You can't make this stuff up. If there's one factor that really figures into, I guess you could say, the emergence of the swords from the Washington family, it's the Civil War. And because things were just drastically different, remember the Washington side with the Confederacy for the most part, they were forced to put this sword up for sale, and it was bought by the state of New York, along with some very valuable papers and a seal in 1871. So away they went. It's kind of a shame that they were put up there in the library where they weren't really often on exhibit, but there they are. $20,000 is what they paid for the whole pile. I paid $20,000 for that whole thing today. But there's a problem. This happens in 1911. The place, which is a fireproof building, doesn't burn down. Everything in it burns. Guess what was not in the safe? Washington's sword. His seal, the papers, they were locked up. They were okay. But not the sword. In fact, a story which appeared in the newspaper in the 1920s talks about a fellow who's there doing the cleanup work, and he overhears people talking, "Hey, where's Washington's sword at?" And he goes, "I saw a really weird, twisted up piece of metal. I threw it in that rubbish heap over there." And he went and got it. It was Washington's sword. It was an absolute mess. It was this close to being thrown out when they were cleaning up after the fire. But it does have a happy ending. Here's a newspaper article from 1940 on the eve of World War II. I love this headline. Irishman finally untwist George Washington's sword. Yep. By this fellow named Maloney. Listen to this. George Washington's dress sword is on display in the State Education Building today, and Benedict Maloney, acting superintendent, has satisfied a 13-year itch. Reputedly the gift of Frederick the Great of Prussia, the weapon was twisted like a pretzel from a fire in 1911 and was stored away with other junk. When Maloney got his job 13 years ago, he asked permission to try his hand at straightening it. His grandfather had taught him metalworking in Ireland. He was refused. Experts said the sword would break in bits. Through the years, Maloney hankered to do the job. The other day, the new state librarian finally gave in to his pleas. Maloney worked 45 minutes and the sword emerged from the forge straight and true. Said Maloney, that piece of work is one of the big thrills in my life. So, today, lots of school kids get to admire George Washington's sword in the State Library of New York. So it does have a happy ending. We're going to move on to the military swords. And again, this is probably more loosey-goosey than any of the other chapters, because military swords can mean a number of different things. The one thing they all have in common, they were all gifts. First one we're going to look at is sword number 4, the one chosen by Judge Bushrod Washington. I'm getting there. I got my timer going. So, keep going? Good. Now, this sword was traditionally thought of, up until fairly recently, as George Washington's mourning sword. And a mourning sword is just the sort of thing you would acquire to wear to a funeral, which means it's going to be black. It's going to have a blackened metal hilt and a grip bound with usually something like braided horsehair. That looks kind of festive to me. Doesn't it look a little festive to you? It's not a mourning sword. It's actually a patterned military sword. It's a French model 1767 épée. And in fact, it's widely known that when Lafayette came back with news of sort of the French throwing in with the revolutionary cause, with Rochambeau coming over with 6,000 men to support Washington on Lermion, he brought with him, in his own words, a few packages of presents for my division. And in fact, other officers who served with him during the war recall, the Marquis has give fresh instance of his munificence by presenting each officer in his division with a neat gold-gilt small sword. But the best piece is the one you see right here. This is also property of Morristown National Historic Park. This one is engraved, presented by the Marquis de Lafayette, Major General of the Army of the United States, to James Giles, Lieutenant in the 2nd or New York Regiment of Artillery, September 9th, 1780. And it was presented to a predecessor, the Washington Society of New Jersey in the 1860s, with a letter where Lieutenant Giles himself talks about getting the sword directly from Lafayette. So, are we to believe that Washington went out and bought a common regulation French Army officer's sword when his protege, the Marquis de Lafayette, was given out to all his buddies? Probably got this from the Marquis de Lafayette. I think that's a pretty good bet. Remember, it was swapped. This sword kind of had a rough life. It went to John Washington. John Washington was killed in the Civil War, unfortunately. But his heirs knew they had this Washington sword. They sought to protect it and to hide it from marauding Yankees. It was hidden in a pigeon house. Yeah. You know something? They didn't get it. The sword so corroded that it lost all the inscription on its blade and the scabbard leather disappeared. And it was in pretty sorry condition. It was pretty rough. And then matters got worse. It was broken. In fact, it was broken by Lawrence Washington in 1876, who put down on paper, documented, I further certify that I broke the sword in 1876. There was a good reason. It was going up for sale in Philadelphia, where you can see the scabbard is gone. You can see the break in the sword over here before the band was applied to it. And it was bought by a guy from Orange, New Jersey, named William F. Havemeyer, who gave it to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association in 1892. And this was probably the first time a George Washington sword appeared at auction. I'm stepping it up because I'm running out of time. I got 2 more to cover. I was serious about keeping you here to breakfast. Thankful I'm paying attention to this. Sword number 3 is the greatest curiosity, the one that went to George Steptoe Washington. It's got the nickname the Alti Broadsword, and that's exactly what it is. This sword showed up under mysterious circumstances in a Philadelphia tavern. It was bought by an interested third party and made its way to Washington with a letter saying, "Hey, I saw this valuable sword in Philadelphia. It's got your name and picture on it. I think it's worth a lot of money. It's probably a gift, and you should have it, but, anything you want to give me for it, I'll take it." Okay, and you can read all about this in the book because there are so many letters concerning this actual sword. Washington, perplexed, writes to John Quincy Adams, who is doing diplomatic duty on the continent, and says, "See what you can find out about this." And he basically does find out the story. It's the product of a Prussian smith named Theophilus Alti, who isn't a swordsmith, but he is in the sword trade. We're not exactly sure what he made. And he sends this sword with his son to America. And this sword is a present for the great General Washington, who he admires greatly. Or is it here's my wayward kid who doesn't want to stay in Germany. Look how we can do good work. Maybe you want to set him up in business. I think it's a little bit of both. But Washington was very perplexed by this sword. He even received a number of letters from the sword maker himself saying, "Hey, did you get the sword? Have you seen my son?" Washington doesn't seem to have replied. And I'm guessing it's not really the kind of sword Washington would have liked. I mean, it's a big, heavy, poorly balanced cavalry saber. Washington wasn't a cavalryman. He was a retired president at this point. And it's covered with all sorts of engravings. Here we have George Washington himself trampling the British lion and unicorn. Wow. It's pretty heroic. And the sword is just covered with stuff. We have an escutcheon with 13 stars under a liberty cap. That makes sense. Some beautiful samples of decorative metalwork that this man could execute. We have, what do we have over here? Some military trophies. Oh, I should look at the actual picture here. Sunbursts, quiver bow and arrows. This is the one I can't figure out. We have a chicken in a basket on a tree. I'm getting a little hungry, so you can tell. The sword came with its scabbard, beautifully wrought. It is a masterpiece of workmanship. But it's not a practical, functional sword, and it's not really the sort of sword that Washington ever would have carried or had much of a use for. So it's a curiosity. The last one is kind of a half sword. This thing is absolutely stunning. This is a sword that was under work and ready to be presented to Washington as a thank you from various Frenchmen that served under him in the Revolution that were grateful for the inspiration he provided to the French Revolution. But Washington died before the sword could be sent over, and he never got it. So it's kind of sort of one of Washington's swords, but he never saw it. Now, that sword resides at the White House. Edouard Daladier, who was the premier of France, presented it to President FDR in 1933. And if you're lucky enough to get into the White House, you can see it hanging in the library. That really is kind of an end cap to this sort of whirlwind tour of Washington swords in 58 minutes and 7 seconds. So, thank you. Never been able to find any evidence of that. If he did, it was probably a sword that was given to somebody in the Custis family. It doesn't seem like Washington left anything to the Custises. Let me see if there was any...
Michael Korda's Clouds of Glory references said he carried it.
I've read that, but I've never been able to find out anything about it. I'm looking at the... none of the Custises bought a sword at the estate sale in 1802.
Eric, I can answer that.
Oh, you can? Yeah?
Washington purchased it as a gift for Custis when he became a cornet in U.S. Light Dragoons during the Quasi War in France. So it was purchased for George Parke. It was purchased for George Washington Parke Custis by Washington. It was never one of Washington's swords per se. It was a silver-mounted cavalry officer's broadsword.
Cool. Do we know where it is?
No, I've never been able to
I've
track
contacted Washington and Lee looking for it. It seems to have gone, which is amazing. You know, 'cause
I've
Lee
looked
dies.
at the original purchase invoices and the records on it, but not the sword itself.
You would think, you know, Lee dies in 1871. You would think something like that would have been treasured and whereabouts known. So there are treasures out there waiting to be discovered. Thank you, Jim. Anybody else? Oh, sir.
In the president's office at William Jewell College in Liberty, Missouri, is a sword that was, they say, was given to Washington by Lafayette. And I just wondered if you had any comment or further information about that.
There are a lot of swords that have Washington provenance. That one is not one that's ever been on my radar. We tried to stick with swords that have good family provenance, just because there are so many swords out there that have legends like that. I'm unaware of it. I'd love to take a look at it. If you know, we can talk later, and I'll give you my email address. Let's see what the sword is. Yeah, maybe not. You know. Sir?
Yeah, the sword that Cornwallis.
I need you to speak into the microphone. We're filming.
The sword that Cornwallis gave to Benjamin Lincoln at Yorktown, would it have been customary that he returned to General Cornwallis afterwards?
I believe so.
But none of those battle swords would have been part of his collection.
I've never seen a sword presented, or excuse me, a sword surrendered, you know, after a major capitulation that, you know, has a provenance that suggests anything like that. So I think it was largely ceremonial. I think, you know, he who was taking the surrender had a lot of flexibility. If he was going to treat his adversary as a gentleman versus treat his adversary as a vanquished barbarian. And I don't think the British and the Americans really kind of saw each other to that level. At least I'm hoping they didn't.
Were the swords used as jewelry, or was there ever human blood on them?
It's very possible. For instance, I've never read an account of Washington doing damage to another human being with a sword, but it's very possible there was blood on the small sword that he was carrying at Braddock's expedition, Braddock's failure, because there were a lot of bloody people around that he would have had to draw in combat. So I couldn't say for sure. I try not to think about swords in terms of whether or not they're bloody. You know?
It's said that Washington's eldest brother Lawrence arranged for him to have fencing lessons when he was a teenager. Were you able to do any research to look into that?
I didn't, because a fencing sword doesn't really have anything to do with this, and they did have fencing swords in the period. So that's more of a piece of sporting equipment than a piece of masculine jewelry and military equipment. So different function whatsoever.
But we do know he took fencing lessons.
Yes, yes. I don't think he would have been fencing with his small swords, though.
Okay, we're good. Which swords would Washington have used in some of the lesser recorded twilight years of the Revolution, like the very early 1780s, or the Whiskey Rebellion, which was afterwards? Or something like that?
Well, I think, you know, the three that I would associate with the post-1780 period would be that really gaudy steel-hilted small sword, which he did the blade swap on in 1779. Certainly that. That was with him in upstate New York. I would think certainly the Bailey, green-handled Kato for sure. And I would also say the small sword of 1767, because that's the one he traditionally wore when he resigned his commission. So I think he would have had a number of swords with him. So. One more? Oh, we have two hands though. You choose.
The Alti sword has the engraving of Washington on it. And
Yes.
in the engraving, he's got a sword. Is that any sword in particular?
Not that I can tell. I don't think Alti would have had any idea what kind of swords Washington had. So. Is that it? You kicking me off? Okay.
Thanks so much, Eric. That was really wonderful. And you've added lots more, even beyond what's in the book. So what a great evening. I want to invite all of you who are interested. We have the galleries open, and so you'll be able to see, brought back together for the first time in more than 200 years, 3 of Washington's Revolutionary War era swords, the 1767 small sword from our collection, the silver lion-headed Kato that Brian Hendelson has generously loaned us, and the Bailey Kato that the Smithsonian Institution has generously loaned us from their collection. So you can see those 3 brought back together. And so we have books too. And we have books available that Eric will be signing.
Brian too?
And Brian too. So thank you all very much.